like to begin with a very personal anecdote. When I was quite young, probably in first or second grade or so, we had what, for me, growing up in a little town in West Virginia, was a great adventure. My parents took my brother and me to Washington, our nation's capital. We went on the bus. It was a long overnight trip. They knew I would be so excited about this. They didn't tell me until the morning we left. And it was really quite a highlight of my life to get out and see the big, exciting city that's our nation's capital. On the way, we drove through a little town somewhere in Maryland, and the bus pulled up to a restaurant to stop and let people get something to eat. There was a young black man who I suppose, looking back on it, was probably in his early to mid-20s, carrying his little daughter. And when we stopped at that restaurant, they would not serve him, and they would not serve the little girl. And my mother decided that this was not a reasonable thing, and she had heard what the man had tried to order for his little girl, which was a bowl of soup. So my mother ordered an extra bowl of soup. And the waitress, of course, did not refuse her, but before she handed the bowl of soup to my mother, she reached over and just laden it with pepper. And that electric moment has just always been with me ever since, and I think that was the time at which I lost some of my naivete about racial relations in America and so forth. I actually started school in segregated schools. I was educated in public schools in my hometown, and my home state desegregated its schools just about a year or 2 years prior to the Supreme Court decision, but operating under the same set of social forces, so that I was in about 8th or 9th grade at the time the schools became integrated. And it was kind of a magic moment. There were a lot of things that were not good about the 50s, but growing up as a young person in small-town America in the 50s was actually a very positive and wonderful time I look back on. And the new youngsters who came to our school from what had been previously the segregated black junior high school and so forth were an extraordinary bunch. I still know where many of them are today and what they're doing. They've been rather successful in life. And for whatever reason, it was a society that had a lot of cohesion, black and white, despite the fact that we'd grown up in legally segregated worlds. And from that, I just learned that underneath we are all the same, that we have very common sets of goals and values. So it became very painful to me over time to see how that society that I got a rather idealistic view and experience of began to degenerate and pull apart and in some ways develop more insidious forces than were present when we had crystal clear and legally enforced segregation. And so those two experiences, I think, have very much shaped the way I think about diversity, and particularly relations between African Americans and whites in this country. Looking toward a more recent part of my personal history that I think is very relevant to the question of, is there really a value to diversity in an educational setting, in a business setting, in a life setting? As an engineer, I like to think a lot in terms of analogies. Engineers often draw analogies between circuits and mechanical systems, and sometimes you can understand one better than the other but learn the same lessons. As I review my life, I think about my education, and particularly my education in graduate school. My thesis advisor grew up in Turkey, came to this country and earned his doctoral degree here at MIT, as a matter of fact. My closest friend as a graduate student was a young man who came from India, who grew up in the area around Bombay. As I left graduate school and entered the early years as a faculty member, two of my very closest professional and personal friends, one was a Hungarian who left Hungary during the '56 revolt, literally as a young freedom fighter. Another whose office was next to me, who I've remained very close to over the years as a faculty member and colleague and friend, had grown up in Taiwan, spent much of his life in Japan after the Second World War. And there was never any doubt about the way in which that international kind of cultural diversity brought a richness and a content to my life, personally as well as professionally, that simply wouldn't have been there otherwise. And we spent lots of time in our free moments talking about the way our different backgrounds had influenced our perspectives. One of my friends is a graduate student who also worked for the same Turkish professor as his thesis advisor, grew up in Finland. And if you look at the history of the Finnish people, they're very closely tied to the same people who populated Turkey, and we would spend long hours looking at sort of the legends and epic poems and so forth and stories that they knew in common. So these things have always fascinated me, and I draw the same kind of analogy between that international multiculturalism that I was so much the beneficiary of in my years, both being educated and as an educator. And I think that the same thing has to be true as we look at various racial and ethnic groups within our own nation. So I do fundamentally believe that diversity is a good thing, and that just as in the history of Europe, the great flowering of literature and so forth that occurred as the British people and the French people merged and became one, I'm enough of an optimist to believe that in time the same kind of thing is going to happen in this great nation, and perhaps is happening in at least an incipient way right now. So yes, I do believe there is an intrinsic value in diversity and learning through different eyes and listening to different voices. It sometimes is more difficult to think about in the context of science and engineering, the professional worlds that I have tended to inhabit, because while some would argue that these are perhaps not subjects that are totally without political content and so forth, I think by comparison to other fields of study, students who are involved in science and engineering tend to have a little more in common and a little more common focus and direction to their way of thought and so forth than in perhaps other fields. And it's made it a bit easier for us, I think, to build a diverse community and to work together. On the professional level, for many years while I was a faculty member and ultimately an administrator at the University of Michigan, I was involved in one way or another with efforts to recruit minority students, to build educational programs on the campus, and work with groups like the Society of Black Engineers and Society of Hispanic Engineers. I always considered it one of the fun parts of my job. These groups I found there, and I have found in my contacts here at MIT certainly as well, are among the most highly motivated and the most self-supportive groups that we have on campus. And I think that's wonderful, and I think the rest of us can learn something from that, and I hope that we do. Looking in a more pragmatic context, and I don't think we should be afraid to be pragmatic, one also has to recognize that our society has the makeup that it has, and we know perfectly well within a time frame of 20 years or 30 years exactly what the racial and ethnic makeup of this country is. And on a pragmatic scale, we simply must learn to live and work and advance together. The historical forces make it a difficult task. The current economic forces make it an even more daunting set of problems. But if we are to be a great nation in the future, somehow we have to resolve and come to grips with it. So I think even in a pragmatic sense, as well as a moral sense, we as a leading institution of education and research in the United States in the 1990s must be dedicated to educating increasing numbers of students from the various components of the American population. We must produce from those communities the leaders that the nation's going to need downstream in 20 or 30 years. So there will be no backing off of this institution's commitment to these matters, despite the fact that we are in rather difficult economic times. It's got to be very, very high on our agenda. At the same time, we must never be naive about what is involved, about the depth of effort that is going to be required. And as we do with any student, we win these battles and make our progression one individual at a time, by individuals' commitments, by what we can provide to individuals, by what we can learn from them. And I hope as a leader that I can play at least some modest part in inspiring and leading our community on to undertake this very important role. I have enjoyed the contact I have had these last 3 years with the students on the MIT campus. My wife and I have made a habit of roughly every week or so, as calendar permits, spending an evening eating in a dormitory or an independent living group or what have you. We've made the rounds of probably 100 and some living situations. And the students here are just wonderful and remarkable. Every group has its own tone. But I again must be honest with you that I never am more inspired or feel better about our community than those contacts I have with our minority students. We've spent evenings at Chocolate City in deep discussions. They've been open and candid, and I come away feeling very good, despite the fact that we know we're working with hard problems occasionally. I'm extremely supportive of and excited about this video project. I think that the idea of letting each group communicate in a very natural and free and open way, and then ultimately merging these together to really show us the fabric of our student body is something we're going to learn from. I don't know where it's going to lead. I don't know what the commonalities and differences are going to be, but it's a true MIT approach to a problem. We're going to get in there and we're going to learn, we're going to get the objective data and the viewpoints, and I'm just very excited about it and think it's really a leadership kind of activity. As you know, I have seen the first video that was made by our African American students, and there was at least one immediate lesson in looking at that which quite honestly surprised me. And that was the fact that almost every one of the students, in talking about their personal observations of racial relations and so forth on the campus from their personal perspective, immediately homed in on the instructional aspects of MIT. Almost all of the anecdotes that they passed on to the rest of us had to do with classroom or other learning situations. That's very important for us all to understand. It certainly is important for me to understand as an administrator and a leader on the campus. The bad news is it shows problems in the most fundamentally important aspect of what we do, but the good news is that's something that we can consciously be aware of and try to work together as a community to improve. So I see this as a wonderful discovery and learning tool, and I'm very grateful to all of you who are participating in the project. One of the things that is clearly true of American business today is that in virtually every domain there are no longer American businesses. We talk a lot in the government and in academia about the internationalization, the globalization of business. Frankly, it's happened. I talk to business leaders here in Boston. I can think of the CEO of one major manufacturing concern whose brand name everybody would recognize, told me that 12% of their business is in the United States right now. As I talk to executives, they're more and more making it clear that the way to advance in their companies today, particularly along the executive chain, is to understand other nations, other cultures, know other languages. Many corporations are simply decreeing that those people on a strong upwardly mobile track in the company are going to have to live overseas and experience an overseas operation for a while. Typical U.S. manufacturing companies today have locations in 20, 30, 40 different places around the world, sometimes more. It's no longer a matter of, is this a good thing to do? It's a matter of, you must do it if you're going to survive. And I think that's going to drive a great opening of the American mind. Because of our inherent strength, our system of government, the strength of our economy over the last 30, 40 years, we have been incredibly insular and isolated in many ways. We're isolated geographically, and we've been isolated, I think, socially and culturally far too much. Certainly, many of the greatest experiences of my life, things that I deeply value, have been opportunities, particularly through my scientific work in earlier years, to associate with people across the world and have people I consider to be good, close colleagues in Asia, in Europe, in Mexico, and in other places. That's going to be more the norm, and I think it's going to be enjoyable and exciting, but it's not a luxury. It's something that we have no choice of, and the more that we can help to jumpstart our students into that world, the better off we will be as an institution and as a nation and businesses as well. One of the things we're very proud of here at the Institute is the MIT Japan program, where, as you know, 50 or 60 of our undergraduates in a given year have committed themselves to learning the Japanese language while they're undergraduates, to taking a sequence of seminars on history and culture and business practice, and then upon graduation, go to Japan for a year or two as interns in an industry or a laboratory or what have you, and come back to this country with that perspective and knowledge and understanding and apply it to our own corporations. We would like to be doing the same thing in Europe and elsewhere. These are small but very powerful and important examples. You mentioned the question of teaching diversity. I find this a very difficult concept to grapple with. I don't know if it is literally possible to teach diversity in the sense that one can teach electronic circuits or calculus or what have you. My suspicion is that we must accomplish education about multiculturalism, about diversity in our society and our activities on many different planes and through many different mechanisms. Some I know would disagree with this philosophy, but I find the subject to be so broad and so complex and so ill-defined that it is not clear to me that one can define a single course or a single curriculum that will satisfy that need for all people. So I think that we need to think about diversity, multiculturalism, understanding history and sociology and technology and other subjects from a broad variety of cultural and racial perspectives in many different ways. I think we have to do it formally, we have to do it informally. This taping project is a beautiful example. Dr. Williams' course is a good example. Mel King's course is a good example. I think we have to do this over and over again in different venues and different ways to fit different people, and kind of just build up an environment where nobody gets through the Institute without some informal, if not formal, exposure to a disciplined thinking about other cultures, other races. There is no simple answer. If I knew it, I certainly would share it and try to implement it, but I think it's a question we need to keep in front of us. We need to try a lot of experiments. It needs to be part of what we think of as the hidden curriculum at MIT, in the same way that professional ethics and other things are, and I hope over time that we can make some progress together.